Fraud and Imposture in the New Testament with Dr. Robert M. Price. Okay, forget that the church may have hit us over the head. This is part 2, okay? I know a lot of people have issues that the church has maybe done things to hide the truth. I mean, for crying out loud, when you have 80,000 pieces of the cross spread all over the place, you can kind of say, maybe I need to check this thing out. But more than the church, we're dealing with the New Testament. Did the authors of the New Testament purposely trick people? Like on purpose with malicious intent? Or did they write it as pious fraud, like something that had not such an ill intent necessarily when they wrote it? That is something that's being explored in this show with Dr. Bob. I hope you guys like it. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to comment. I appreciate you guys checking out Myth Vision Podcast. We are Myth Vision.
Okay, wake up, Derek. Snap out of it now.
Oh, I'm definitely here. You said some very interesting things, Dr. Bob. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting, and I don't know if this is completely literary in nature, what we're dealing with here, or if there is some fraudulent stuff, because I had heard that there was an engineer, and I can't remember the man's name. He was well known and hired by the temple priest, pagan, you name it. The doors would automatically open, and they would have ways that the gods would somehow, and they would have engineering tools to trick the people to throw their shekel, their coin into the pot. You know, hey, let me get this coin of yours because the gods are answering the prayers. Do you think that some places I mean, obviously based on that, you don't necessarily think it's completely charlatan type stuff, but it does seem kind of strange when I look at Paul, and I'm sure my audience would agree. When you look at Paul, those things that we've been taught to think, the 7 authentic. I mean, I already have that in my head. I immediately think 7 authentic, most original. Then you got the Gospels, starting with Mark, getting between Matthew, probably next, and Luke, but depends on who you're looking at. Then you get to John, and John could be somewhere around the time, a little before the Acts. And then you have the pastoral epistles. And it's like this way that we're looking at it. But the 500, you would think the Gospels would use that argument. And you kind of are doing a Pauline epistle argument in this as well, it seems.
Like, why would it not have been mentioned there or even in the Gospels?
Right. Like, why wouldn't they have mentioned the 500? They're like, John seems to be the most in trying to prove Jesus really died and really rose.
Right.
So why didn't they mention 500 in the Gospel of John? I mean, wouldn't that have been an important part? I mean, they're willing to say, I suspect if all the things he did were contained in books, the world itself could not contain all the books that would be written therefore. It's like, this would be a perfect apologetic point to say he also appeared to 500.
Yeah, I think that it is just somebody winging it, trying to solve this very problem. Why is it not in the public? And the one attempt to explain this, Jesus and our pal of mine, excuse me, suggested that this was worked up by or perhaps based on a misreading of a story that also appears in Acts, namely the day of Pentecost, because there you've got the 120 disciples who received the Holy Spirit and began to speak in tongues, and that Pentecost itself means the 50th day, and that somehow this got mixed up as to Jesus appearing to not 120 on the 50th day, but to 500. It looks a little better than that in Greek, but that just seems to me pretty lame. I mean, it's possible, but even if that is the case, it just shows that it's a later fabrication, even if by mistake. Like, I'm trying to say that there are a lot of things that are not authentic, but aren't necessarily malicious hoaxes. And
Right.
some are, though. I'm thinking like these resurrection appearances kind of look like that, the Ananias and Sapphira thing, and so forth. That's trickery. In fact, after I wrote this, I began to think maybe that the kind of textual funny business that Bart points out would have to be considered pious frauds. I mean, I can see what motivated them, but I guess everybody always can see that. That probably does count
Right.
as fraud. But the rest of them, like I just can't believe Matthew is saying, I think I'll change the saying of Jesus about divorce because maybe I want to have one. Okay, except for. No, it's just obvious to me that Christians understood that saying as forbidding divorce, which I don't think it does anyway. I think that's been grossly misunderstood. Like Jesus says, Moses gave you that commandment because the hardness of your heart. He doesn't say the human hearts are any less hard. He's just saying this is not the preferred will of God. So I don't think it was, but as Martin Debelius said, Christians began to take comments of Jesus, whoever invented them, as laws. It's understandable how they would, and that this was one of them. It didn't even mean that, but it had become that in Matthew's day, and he felt he had to amend the text to make it livable. And that's not deception. He's just amending the Constitution, so to speak. And it's like you said, there's a kind of literalism among ex-fundamentalists that seems to still hang on to the idea if there are errors, then the Bible is not inerrant and therefore it's not inspired and authoritative. Now, that general thinking, I think, is correct. I mean, you can say, as a lot of more liberal theologians do, Catholics and Protestants, that who says inspiration is incompatible with fiction, with parables, even with opposing viewpoints from James and Paul? Well, you can say that, but inspiration really reduces to nothing. I mean, it doesn't guarantee anything. I mean, if you're saved by grace through faith alone, in Ephesians is on, if that's just Paul's opinion, well, that really doesn't help us. It's not like an argument between Luther and Zwingli. These guys are supposed to be the voice of God. So yeah, I think their logic is quite correct. The Bible is, if it's not without error, or if it's even ambiguous, it's not inspired, or even if it is, it means nothing. So they're right about that. But to make everything malicious scheming, there is some of that, I think, but not in every case. And like this thing with that really got us started on this, the Rabbi Singer's claim, though I didn't hear that. I don't have time to listen to anybody's podcasts, even ones I've done. So I don't know what he's saying. But if he is saying that the Septuagint is, number one, not based on earlier Hebrew manuscripts, much earlier than the Masoretic text, I think that's just totally wrong.
I don't think he says that the Septuagint isn't based on. I think that he pretty much, in his point in his show with me, we didn't go into much detail. I'd like to get a scholar in the Septuagint and understanding the Proto-Masoretic over against the Septuagint in details. What he suggests is that the Christologies in the New Testament have really been pushed into the New Testament and into the Septuagint by the Church Fathers, 2nd, 3rd century. Somewhere around there, as the New Testament is being compiled, the development of the New Testament is taking place, they're incorporating Christologies in the Septuagint. So there's corruption on the Septuagint, whereas the Masoretic isn't. It's practically been the same. And my question, and I might be misunderstanding some of the things he was trying to say. He gave me a couple of his books to check out called Let's Get Biblical, and he sent me them. But one of the things that I've heard said is, no. These passages that you're suggesting, for example, Isaiah 61, where it adds in Luke chapter 4 that he gave sight to the blind, someone said you can go to the oldest source for the Septuagint and find it in there. So the oldest known source of the Septuagint, they're arguing there is sight to the blind in that passage, whereas the ones we now have in our Old Testament for ESV, whatever, we start looking in our Bibles on our phones or whatever, you're not going to find giving sight to the blind. They took it out later. So either the Septuagint took it out later and the Masoretic text doesn't have it there, or, what is this? Is the New Testament quoting an older version of the Septuagint that's accurately saying giving sight to the blind? My really big thing that I've been trying to do on this show is, I guess because I am kind to the text, I have been very kind to the New Testament and very kind to the authorship, and I feel like very respectful for someone who's a skeptic and comes at it like this. I'm trying to find issues. I'm trying to look for haha. And I know that's difficult to do unless you approach it like most haters of the text or haters of the biblical, stories come at it and say, like I said earlier, this bear eating 42 kids is literally the dumbest thing if you literally look at it. And I get it. I agree. If God really sends an actual bear to literally kill 42 kids for calling Elijah bald, that's absurd. However, I would say this is celestial. To me, it doesn't seem like that would be a normal, it just doesn't make sense to me. But then again, God has also wiped out every man, woman, and child through the hands of Israel to do crazy stuff. So I'm open to that as well. And I wanted to look for the New Testament caught red-handed doing things by manipulating the text. And you hinted at it in a way. It wasn't like, ha, 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 but it was like, hey, these old texts that had context probably back then during, the Maccabean times, possibly the Babylonian captivity that's being mentioned in plenty of places, they're giving it life in their own context and reinterpreting it in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
I think Rabbi Toby Singer's saying that doesn't work. Like David in the Psalms, right? Jesus quotes it. It's obvious that's talking by, he believes David wrote it, but nonetheless, it's obvious the whole pierced my hands and my feet situation. It's obvious whoever wrote it was writing it about trials and stuff they had going on then. It was
Right.
it was
Yeah.
not.
Nobody disputes that, and the idea that that the scrolls writers, and then Matthew seems to have had, it was like the Bible code that was around about 20 years ago, that they predicted events in modern times, and no ordinary straightforward reading would yield that. They admitted that. They just thought there was this clever secret way of decoding the text.
Right.
Well, that's I don't buy that, but it's not like anybody corrupted the text. It was just sort of a ventriloquism. It was like allegorizing in the medieval church. They didn't pretend that it was actually talking about indulgences or the Pope or something. They just said that there's an allegorical meaning. Well, once you do that, the Bible is a ventriloquist dummy, and the Dead Sea Scrolls people and the New Testament writers were doing that. If they said, as well as Joseph Wellis and others said, that you look at these passages, when Hosea 11:1 says, out of Egypt I have called my son, well, hey, there you go, that's the Holy Family going into Egypt. No, but his point was, Matthew is a con man. He knows you won't be able to look this up because people didn't have Gideon Bibles in the drawer to consult. And so the writer is just saying, this ought to get him. But of course, they had some reference to it, because why quote it otherwise?
Right.
But my real problem with this is, that's not, it's, in a way, it's manipulation of the text, but just sort of pretending that there's a hidden meaning. Be sure to drink your Ovaltine. It's not like nobody has changed it. Like Muslims claim that originally Jesus predicted the coming of someone named Ahmad, which is another version of Muhammad. And that was based on a Greek text that said not that the Paraclete would come, the Parakletos, but that the Perikletos would come, the illustrious one, which would mean the same thing as Ahmad, and that Christians have changed the text. Well, we know that's not true, because we have copies of the New Testament earlier than Muhammad, and it doesn't read that way. The same thing here, like when you have Paul in Romans 3, adding a word or something that brings the quote closer to what he's saying, I don't assume he had a copy of the text. It's like I assume that whoever wrote this thought that passage was relevant and remembered it wrong. So they're putting what they thought it meant. People still do that accidentally. The thing in Matthew where it says in the nativity story, it quotes one of the minor prophets, and it says, "Oh, Bethlehem of Judea, you are by no means least among the tribes of Israel." Well, any version of the Old Testament says, "Though you are least." Well, okay, it's obvious he figures that Bethlehem needs a little more of a halo around it. That's insignificant, though. How is that a deception about anything? So I don't see that, and the notion that Christians changed the Septuagint by adding like Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. We know they didn't do that. I
Well,
mean, again, you can look at the manuscripts, and plus, if you wanted to do that, it would look like it. By straightforward interpretation, there are no predictions of Jesus. If you were trying to make it look like there were, it would look completely different. It would look just like the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, where you have explicit references to the Son of God dying and rising. It's obvious it's been Christianized. That's what you would have done, or you're totally wasting your time. Plus, there's nothing all that different from the Hebrew. I mean, I was looking at quotes from the Septuagint versus the original. Often it's no big deal. So I just don't see any validity to that, except the point that, yes, there weren't predictions of Jesus, but there are none in the Septuagint either.
right. Okay. That's what I was going to say. So driving that point home, technically, do you think the authors of the New Testament did kind of what, if you're looking in the field of eschatology of idealist, and what idealists do is they find the circumstance that's current in their own life situation, and they somehow morph the scripture to fit that agenda or that eschatology. Like today, look in the newspaper, you'll find out George W. Bush and Donald Trump and Obama and this and this and that's fulfilling the mark of the beast and the devil and the temple, the third temple is being rebuilt. It's all this like modern, fundamentalist eschatological approach. The idealism, it's a repeat type of through human history. In a sense, it has a repetitive fulfillment and it keeps going in a circular manner, so to speak. It keeps going.
Well, that I think is close to what is actually going on, but it veers off in a fatal way.
Right.
In the Journal of Higher Criticism, we had a great article by Rabbi Jacob Neusner, who says that it's typological in the sense that that there are paradigm cases in the Bible, and he's thinking of the Old Testament, but like the Exodus from Egypt. This you can apply this to the Babylonian captivity and other things, saying that history tends to repeat itself, and we're discerning the signs of the times. Hey, this has happened before. What did they do then? Maybe we can
Right.
get some guidance out of it. And the same is true with these prophecies, Revelation, Daniel, and all that. Only it's significantly different in that they use cipher language. It's ambiguous, like the Nostradamus oracles, and they're not that clear as to what they're talking about. So it's like a Rorschach test. You're kind of reading stuff into them. That I think is illegitimate, and especially when people like even dispensationalists whose whole shtick was to take the Old Testament literally, not to do it figurative and make it a ventriloquist dummy. When they say, "Oh yeah, we know that the original meaning referred to the Babylonians or something," but there's the abomination of desolation, something like that. Yeah, that's Caligula or Antiochus Epiphanes, but it also looks forward to
Right.
the Antichrist. Where do you get that as a Protestant? You're just basically doing voodoo again.
Yeah.
that's utterly illegitimate if you claim to be a literalist. I don't understand how they let themselves do that.
They pick and choose when they decide to say type and anti-type or types and shadows, and then they say, oh no, that's the final. And here's the funny thing is, and just throwing it in there, and then I don't want to throw you off track because I know you're on a roll here. In the New Testament Gospel, Matthew 24, right? They'll say, oh, even the destruction of the temple is just a type of the future final destruction. But it indicates to me, and as a preterist from coming out of preterism, to me, this was supposed to be the be all. Okay. So whether you say this is universal, apocalyptic, like worldwide, or if you think this is temple centric and Israel only in the sense that it's supposed to be the apocalypse for them. Okay. Regardless, this was supposed to be the be all from my perspective, but the Christians have to have their faith. So they want to push the resurrection. They got to push all this crazy into the world stuff. Fast forward it, since it didn't happen, that's another type and shadow, and it just keeps happening. If it doesn't happen the way they think it's supposed to, it's going to keep happening. And you say the same thing about why you're mythicist over against why you don't believe in full preterism, because you say the first coming of the actual Messiah had to be invented, Jesus Christ, by them, because he never came. And so in a traumatic event like the temple, and I think if we go to Bruno Bauer, even though he has a historical Jesus, taking his ideas and the temple being the motive, I can see in a traumatic place like this why Israel would concoct the Messiah that was missed, that was behind closed doors, that nobody saw or really, but only a select elect, chosen few, you know? And so it's interesting. Sorry, I didn't want to throw you off.
No, that's quite right. It's another version of like when the Jehovah's Witnesses set a date, and several of them, and they all passed with nothing happening. So they had to make it invisibly happening off stage. Well, Jesus did assume the messianic throne, but it was in heaven. It's like they're putting. This is exactly what Clifford Geertz, great anthropologist of religion, said, that religion is a cultural system of symbols that posits an adjacent, unseen realm in which everything will be resolved. I don't understand this Bible contradiction, but when we get to heaven, we'll find out. Or I don't understand why God allowed so-and-so, but he'll tell us when we get to heaven, etc. Or where's the justice here? Hey, look, don't worry. At the resurrection, everything will be equalized. Not now. I mean, we'll never see it in this world. So you have to posit that. And this is the same kind of thing. The thing with the Roman Empire and the revived Roman Empire. Oh well, that's going to come about again with a common market and so forth. Where do you? I mean, it's just desperation. You're multiplying these things, and there's no grounds for that except that you can't believe in the straightforward fact. Though I just wanted to finish one thought, that what Neusner says is applicable to the New Testament, and in the sense where you see certain biblical stories as paradigms. And I like to use the example of fundamentalists thinking that the universal product code was the mark of the beast, or that if computer chips are inserted subcutaneously, they'll say, oh, that's the Antichrist. Well, no, but yeah. It's not that this was what the Bible was predicting, but it comes so close to the kind of scenario the Bible is describing that you should discern the signs of the times and say, doesn't this seem familiar? I'm going to get a thing where the government can follow me and do this and that, cancel my credit and all that. I'm not doing that. That's the Antichrist. Yes, it is. I mean, not literally, not with a 666, but it's the same thing. So they're right in one sense, and that's why their view does not seem utterly stupid. There is a point to it. But it's they're making that obscure by it's just like Pentecostals speaking in tongues.
Right.
They're not speaking in foreign languages, but that doesn't mean they're lunatics. This is a very ancient thing to express these transcendent feelings that go beyond human speech. I don't ridicule them for it. It's just that they're making it sound stupid by these false claims about it. They're setting up a stumbling block in the way of the value of what they're saying, sadly.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot. And something that I wanted to ask you, I did a study one time. I went and spoke at a church a long time ago. I was coming out of deconstructing from Christianity. And I did this, it was based on full preterism. And really the whole goal of the whole lecture was that the New Testament was the end. It puts the capstone on the pyramid, so to speak. And
Hmm.
what it is it went through, and I showed why Moses and Elijah meet Jesus on this mountain, and the idea is that you got the law, the prophets, and Jesus is the capstone. It's like, here it is, this is the be all. And to me, the reason why I think Christians fall prone to this, just from the narrative alone, if you look at Moses and Joshua and you see that they have similar themes, similar numbers, similar times, from 72 elders to, there's fire and there's clouds, like fire by night and cloud by day. There's wilderness experience. There's 40 years. There's all these weird similarities between Moses and Joshua. Then you get to Elijah and Elisha, and you see the same, it may not be exact. It's the same argument I hear people who are historicists, who I hear arguing against people like you, or making the point that you're out of your mind to parallel Jesus to these dying and rising gods. And they're going, no, it isn't. No, that's an apotheosis. That's not a dying and Jesus was a man according to the narrative. And it's like, okay, all right, how picky does one want to get about the details and not see an overarching theme here and say,
Yeah.
guys, this is what's going on. I hate to break it to you. If a God can die, and yet Jesus, let's say, is a man and he dies and he resurrects and a God resurrects, regardless, dying and rising, and Jesus ends up becoming a God, of course, whether you take Ehrman's view of a developing, evolving Jesus, or he was a demigod, or he was just a regular man, an angelic person, it doesn't matter. Divine, dies, rises, boom. When I looked at the narrative and I saw Elijah and Elisha and saw the same themes, not the identical narrative, but it's very thematically the same. Then I saw the New Testament, and wouldn't you know it, I had like 40 something parallels between Moses, Joshua, Elijah and Elisha, and then in the New Testament from John the Baptist, so to speak, Jesus and the church. And everything from Elijah did 8 miracles or 7 miracles, I think it's 8. And Elisha says, what do you want? I want your double what you have. And sure enough, he performs 16 in the narrative. It's like, what does Jesus do? And then the church, you will perform many more signs. It's the same story. And so I get why, if you believe there's magic in the story, yet you want to literalize it, I believe they're taking the magic of the repetitive nature they're finding throughout the narrative, and that's just going to create a new cult in 100 years from now. That's going to create a new cult in 200 years from now. So I'm not saying it's right.
Well, Mormonism is exactly that. They rewrote the Bible with the names changed and pretty much this and that detail, but it's easy to pick out. In fact, in the book that's going to the press pretty quickly, The Holy Fable, Volume 4, I have a section on the Book of Mormon where I point out how, this comes from there, and this is why Joseph Smith changed it. He wasn't a dope. He was amazingly creative and insightful, and here's what he did with this to bring the Bible to our own day. And but you're right. In fact, there's a couple of great books on the redaction of the prophets and prophetic books that I summarize the arguments in Holy Fable Volume 3. Once you start noticing the parallels with Moses, Elijah, Elisha, and Jeremiah and Isaiah, you begin to realize that the same people that compiled the former prophets, the narrative books like Samuel, Kings, etc., they put together the so-called latter prophets or writing prophets, and that it's based on the material comes from all sorts of places, but that they're striking parallels all through, and you begin to wonder, why was Jeremiah never mentioned in these narrative prophet books, or Ezekiel? How is that possible? Well, they were just created later on the pattern of the guys that are described, and they are created on the basis of Moses and all that. I mean, this is it shouldn't have taken a detective to see this, but we're so bound by Sunday school and so forth that
Hmm.
we don't see it. Though you saw it.
I did while I was a believer. And what blew my mind, in fact, I must give credit to Lex Luthor, Dr. Luther G. Williams. While I and him were not really skeptics, we were in the faith. He communicated to me about this numerical code. Technically, what really appealed to me, and I had seen the Bible code 15, 20 years ago when you used to skip every 39 letter and find out the Twin Towers are in Genesis. By the time you get to Genesis 39, the towers had fallen. And it's like, oh, wow. Well, no, this was a Bible code that I saw that was like gematria based, that was
Mhm.
like, these were skillfully well-written authors who intentionally spelled John. Just to give you one example, it's very creative. I really cannot wait for you to read his book when it comes out.
Oh yeah, I
You
look
will
forward to it.
really cherish this because
Huh.
he shows you that in one of the Gospels, and we just did an episode earlier today, John the Baptist and Herod, okay, in the same narrative, have the same numerical code. When you go to another synoptic gospel, John is spelled with a different
Huh.
numerical value. It's spelled differently, but here's the catch, catch 22. So is Herod. It matches
Wow.
numerically. So you have John the Baptist and Herod in this gospel that numerically literally spells out, I think it's 138 or something. And that is based on the alphanumeric sequence of the name. You spell it out like
Hmm.
alpha is 1 and beta is 2. Well, you do that in Greek and you find out there's a number code there. And the same thing with Herod. When you go to the next gospel, the author spelled John differently and Herod differently, and it
Wow.
matches a different code. So I don't want to give too much there, but my point was he spilled the beans on me that there was this underlying code going on. He went everything from Daniel, the 1290 days, 1335, to
Hmm.
going back to the genealogies of Genesis 5 from Methuselah 969 to the
Huh.
365 and all these numbers, right? I'm like, okay, are we pulling this out of our ass? Or is this like legit stuff that maybe these authors were utilizing in the narratives? I'm convinced, as I was then, that this is so well written, it was divine, right? In my eyes, I was like, God is not only so good that he historically made this stuff happen,
Huh.
but he historically made it happen and numerologically made it all fit perfect. This is inspired. Well, that might be a layer that many overlook. The inspiration of not only carrying a story, but a hidden, if you will, if you have the eyes to see, so to speak, wisdom on catching a numerological narrative there in the text. So the words also make numbers. And it was really fascinating seeing Luther do this. But I go back to the same narrative we're talking about, how we look at the Mormon church. Look at what Joseph Smith did, right? Let's reverse back in history. Let's go back to Moses. Let's go back to the ancient writings. Did they not do the same thing in a way of how they copied to the prophets and such from other cultures? Because
Oh yeah.
when I leave the biblical narrative, I find the 72. I find these interesting patterns, and that's where I have to go, man, this is bigger than I thought. This is pretty big.
Like there's no doubting that in one of these cases with Enoch living 365 years, I mean that's obvious, and then you've got it with somebody's name works out to 666, and you should make the connection, which is hard to make, that just because we tend to think this sort of thing is wacky, we wouldn't do it. That doesn't mean the ancients thought it was wacky, and we know they didn't. So you do have to open the door to this, and I think I'm too old. I'll leave it to you to figure the whole thing out. But
Look, Luther had this figured out 25 years ago about the
mm,
alphanumeric stuff. He was already looking at codes in terms of what he did is he looked at the Greek and he saw in the Greek, just to give you, I got to give you one, man. We dropped this on the last episode. So people who are watching this know we just had this. Adam, Jesus says, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. Scholars all over the place with so much stuff. Okay, I've read, I can't tell you how many Christian and non-Christian commentators on this passage. And I've never heard this one. I don't know if you've heard this. When Jesus told them that, they said, "What do you mean? It took us 46 years to build this temple." Completely obnoxious, right? He said, Jesus is the second or the last Adam. Okay, not the second, the last Adam.
Mm.
Adam, Alpha, Delta, Alpha, Mule. 1, 4, 1, that's 6. Mule's 40. 46. It took us 46 years to build this temple. That is the first Adam. And if you look at Margaret Barker and understand Adam as a temple motif, okay, this is the first temple idea. Okay, this is first temple. Jesus is this, I guess you'd say, second temple. He's supposed to be the king, not Herod. And this is the motif here that really blew me away, that this is Adam. So when he says, "I will rebuild this temple in 3 days," and they said, "But you built it in 46 years, Jesus is replacing Adam,
Mhm.
Adam being the first temple. So I don't know, but I had never heard anything like this. And when he came out with it, I said, I was very skeptical till he showed me 300 other cases that kind of just, I was like, okay,
Wow.
something's going on. I think he has 400 or 500 examples that aren't
Sheesh.
stupid either. They're like, in a passage, there's like 20 places where that same number in the actual paragraph that it's talking about a topic, that number keeps popping up. And he'll take you through that number and show you they're actually going from Daniel. So they're really trying to plug off Daniel's 1290 and 1335 days. Anyway, I don't want to make that about the show. My point is, I get where you're coming from, and I think Rabbi Tovia Singer is actually trying to defend his scripture, right? Because he's a believer in the Old Testament, and he says, look, the New Testament guys, they perverted. They literally went off onto a tangent. What would you say? And I know you're always very polite in the way that you approach these things. What would you say to Rabbi Tovia Singer if he believes he's Orthodox Jewish? He believes they went array. Okay, they went off the charts, and they've abused and they manipulated and they Hellenized and they paganized. And Paul was obviously teaching against Torah, all these things. What would you think about that? And I'm not saying come out of faith, but do you think that this is just a totally different sect of Judaism, and that's why? Or
Oh, well, yeah, like the Sabazios religion in Asia Minor was. They pretty much said that Jehovah and Dionysus were the same, as many people in the ancient Near East thought. Two names for the same God. And they had a fall and a Garden of Eden kind of story. It's pretty clear that Jews assimilated other notions. Even Adam and Eve are so similar to Attis and Cybele in some ways that sure, early Christianity was syncretic or syncretistic, whatever you prefer. But it seems pretty clear to me that so was Judaism. There was no Moses, anything like that. The Moses story about the being set adrift in the Nile was borrowed from the nativity of Sargon, and so on. And I think Judaism is as we know it, is a product of the imposition of Zoroastrianism onto Hebrew religion, and so it's equally syncretistic. All these things are. There is no version of religion that came out of the hand of God just as we find it, but people would like to believe it. Like the Catholics used to say that Catholic doctrine has never changed, and that's just, I mean, Adam Schiff might say that, but it's just not the case. But people don't want to say that it's a human creation. They want to say, oh no, God just stamped it out and here it is. And that's just not the case, but believers never like to hear that.
no, I definitely wouldn't. And I cherished the book. I tried to rectify it. I tried to, with being honest and fair with myself. I really honestly tried, Dr. Bob. And to where I am now, if I began to be so honest with myself as I relapsed a few times, it took me a couple real life traumas for me to stop holding on to my biases and say, I could be wrong, and be open-minded. And that's what it took for me. But once I came to that conclusion, I started to have a more fair representative, I believe, of the text. I don't bash the book. I'm not trying to go out and hurt Christians. I think if your faith helps you stay clean or enjoy your life or benefit you in any way, hey, good. But if you go around proselytizing and causing people to think they're going somewhere they shouldn't, hell or something, and you're coming across with this message, I'm not a fan of that, to be honest with you, and you hurting people. But I came to a conclusion where you mentioned syncretic or syncretistic. I saw that there was a theme. And to me, it went from, well, maybe God, one God, God's bigger than just this book. God's in all of the religions. So then I started going, you know what? My God's bigger than just the Bible. My God is like the God of all. He's been there. Of course, I still had to use a personal pronoun of he. And then I started going, well, it's there. It is there. And I got really strange and said it's energy. And today I'm agnostic. By definition, I guess you'd call me an atheist, but I'm agnostic in the fact that I don't know. But I'm very open-minded to Jesus walking through the window or the door right now, the wall, and saying, touch my hand, touch my side. Then I'll go check out a mental hospital and make sure that I'm not schizophrenic and that I had no substances in my system at the time. And then maybe I'll see if we had any dimethyltryptamine released from the pineal gland. If that didn't happen, I might just become a Christian again. I'm just messing. But regardless, Dr. Bob, I really appreciate you coming on. One last question for our audience. Would you one day, if I can get Rabbi Tovi Singer to come on, you guys are diametrically different in terms of thinking, but nonetheless, would you care to have a show where you guys just had a fair, open conversation about the differences of thought and why? Not a debate, but just an open discussion.
I
Someone asked
tend
that,
not to like these things anymore. They've always struck me as distasteful and futile because there's just
Right.
you have like incommensurable paradigms, as some say, where there's not enough common ground to really communicate.
I understand.
My approach is I like to question people so I can better understand their views. But I generally feel like on Star Trek, the prime directive, I don't want to start making trouble for people. It's just that sometimes the gauntlet is thrown down, and I think you have a misrepresentation of facts. And in the New Testament case, and there I feel like it's my responsibility to say something about that. But that's also a reason I like to remain or become friends with the people I have debated. I just don't. So I'm not sure I would want to. I'm sure I'd respect him and his learning. And he's certainly right about the idea that the fundamentalists are wrong, that they're literal predictions of Jesus in the Old Testament. That's ridiculous. But it's false in a different way than skeptics usually say. It was just sort of a creative misreading, and which is the food and drink of evolving religions.
I think you're right. I mean, they did that. They rewrote it. They rewrote their own narrative, in my opinion, at the time for their own type of group of people, whatever that may have been, as we talked about with Joseph, Osiris, and Jesus. I mean, it's,
Oh yeah, still got to do that.
you better hurry. Oh,
Yeah.
one more, Dr. Bob, one more. I gotta ask you. When you read, and I had to ask you because I just had a friend who came on with a chronological, he has a total view on chronology that we've been mistaken. Okay. That Jesus, or the era of Christianity, the New Testament, is really only 900 years old, not 2000, right? Which is totally like, no one's really delved in this topic, right? Good friend of mine, very nice guy. He's open-minded, and he's just, hey, look, if you can prove him wrong, but he has a hard time believing what we've been told. Regardless, you hear a lot of people always mention the seven Pauline. How do you deal with that in your head when you hear people who are like, okay, the seven authentic Pauline, and then they go into this? How do you, when you're like a one-man army and everyone else thinks authentic, how do you interpret it in your head? Do you just like set it to the side, or?
Basically, yeah. Like when I see books or articles about the theology of Paul, I now say this is really a harmonization, as if you had different Lutheran theologians writing different tracts and you felt obliged to iron out the contradictions. Oh, they're really saying the same thing. It just seems to me a lost cause. And I make the best sense I can of assuming the lucky seven are all by Paul in my Holy Fable Volume 3, and it's not nonsense, but it seems to me that there are real reasons to think these are patchworks, all of them by later writers. That explains too much cogently for me, and it's obvious to me. In fact, I say in this paper why I think people cannot bring themselves to question it, though a few have, and their arguments seem pretty persuasive to me. The Von Manen and Bauer and people like that. So I just can see where they're at. Like, I wouldn't expect a Mormon to agree with my views of the composition of the Book of Mormon. They have too much invested in it. They can't think out of that box. And I don't mean to criticize them or call them bigots or anything. That's way too much. But it makes sense to me that I'm right and they're wrong, though I admit you can't ever prove that. Scholarship juggles paradigms, different lenses through which to view the same material, and they're all tentative, and you just want to see how well they fit the evidence. And that would be the case with any literary work. It is the case. So I'm a pluralist in one sense, but that's really where my sympathies lie.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert McNair Price, he is the fish that swims upstream when everybody's just going with the flow. I try to take my notes from him, and I try to follow in those type of footsteps by being a skeptic, but open-minded and not saying with absolutes about so many things. I do that because I've caught myself being so wrong about so many things so often that I think it's a fair place to be. Be on the lookout. We are going to add the book Holy Fable 4. And when is this release?
I'm guessing it'll still be 2 or 3 months anyway, because I just sent back the corrections and all that yesterday, I think. I don't know how long it'll take them to do it.
Sounds good. We will have that book down in the description. You see our Amazon link there. You guys can go and check out some of the books we have. Be sure to support him too at his website. The website's down in the description. You guys can give him a PayPal. I always give him, out of my own volition, he never asks me to, I always give him a free donation for his time, because time is money. And honestly, I respect this scholar to come on and share his thoughts with me. And I really appreciate you joining me, Dr. Bob.
Oh, it's great fun. It's an honor.
Yeah, and I'm glad we kind of wrestled some of these things we missed on our last episode that we didn't get to touch. So this was a really good episode.
I agree, if I may say so.
If you may say so, we'll tell your wonderful wife I said hey to Quarrel. And you have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy this night. And like I said, I'll be hitting you up soon, as I usually do. And if you have questions, you have ideas, look, you guys can throw it to Dr. Bob. Go give him a PayPal. If you want a question, he can hit me up. I don't have to be the only one who throws him a donation. I mean, for crying out loud, I know this is, you don't work anymore, and your wife's not working anymore like that. So you work from home, and this is the way he supports what he does and takes care of the family. So show him some love. Give him 10% of your tithes, like I said, Lex Luthor this evening. Go ahead and convert now, because this is the Church of Heretics. And
Hallelujah.
hallelujah.